Boardroom Bound, Episode 12. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. Before we jump into the show, I'd like to give a quick thank you this week to 3 people who left a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. S.R. Taylor said, "I've listened to 3 episodes so far. Love the variety of perspectives, including both nonprofit and for-profit. We'll definitely continue to listen." D-Mac said, "What a great concept for a podcast. The subject matter is helpful, and your guests have shared some great ideas and experiences. Thank you, Alexander." Thank you, D-Mac. And Lyndon Reiser said, "Fantastic topic. It's a must-hear for all aspiring board members for nonprofits." Well, thank you so much to those 3 people, and we really appreciate people leaving reviews on iTunes. It's a great way to share word about this show. And if you'd like to leave a rating and reviews, I would appreciate that, and I would especially ask that you leave your blog or some sort of link so that I can give you a shout out and then leave a link in the show notes. In today's show, we'll be speaking with DeForest Soaries, who is a senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Somerset, New Jersey. He is also the former New Jersey Secretary of State, as well as the author of several books on financial freedom. And he is currently a member of the board of directors at Ocwen Financial Corporation, Independence Realty Trust, and Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. And he serves as the compensation chair on all 3 boards. In today's show, we'll be hearing about DeForest's amazing journey from working for nonprofit boards to his first single branch bank board, which led to the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, which led to a public company board, and then, of course, led to another board after that. It's an amazing journey and a great example for all of us how the networking and the branding pays off and the development that comes from that. And now he's paying it forward and he's giving back to everybody else by sharing a course that he's developed, How to Become a Paid Corporate Director. And we've got a special promotion for you related to it. Let's jump into the show. DeForest Soaries, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you because in many ways you're the perfect case study for a lot of the people listening on the phone. I love the story, and we were talking about it before we got on the show, and how you've gone and grown and developed and now are this professional corporate director, so much so that you have a course on this subject that you're teaching other people about it. I know it's a passion topic for you.
Well, I appreciate your interest, and it is a passion. I spent much of my early life working in community and serving in the capacity of director of nonprofit organizations, most of which were broke. and
Right.
and my job was to raise money. And it was as a consequence of my becoming the pastor of a church in central New Jersey, very distressed neighborhood. We had high unemployment, high dropout rates for high school children, high crime rate, worst housing stock in the region. My church set out to do a community revitalization initiative, and in the process of making the plans and meeting people, I met the president of a small bank right around the corner from the church. I was invited to serve on the board of that bank and thought it was a great opportunity to influence access to capital for small businesses and church members. And it was such a different experience for me than the experience I had as a director of local nonprofits that were broke.
Right.
I really liked the experience. I liked the access. And then it was an extra blessing to know that I was getting paid a little stipend for doing it. And since so many people have asked me over the years how they could become corporate directors, and so few people that I knew had really helped me become one, I decided that I would share with others what very few people had ever shared with me. And that's where the course came from.
Now, I love the pay it forward model, but I also like the story about how it started. If I remember correctly, being used to being on nonprofit boards where you paid to play to some extent. Now the reverse was happening unbeknownst to you. And what was in your first board meeting? They gave you a tax form to fill out. Was that how you realized it was different?
Sure. After my first directors meeting, they handed me a W-2 form to complete. And I said to them, why would I fill this out? And they said, well, because we've got to pay you your fees and take out the taxes. I said, pay me. Every other board I've been on, I've had to pay to be on the board. You know, when you're on nonprofit boards, nonprofits need financial support. And the first thing funders will ask is, what are your directors doing?
Mm-hmm.
So I had no idea. I went on that board because I thought it was a good way to influence certain decisions that happened in the neighborhood. It certainly was a chance for me to learn more about banking and finance. And much to my surprise, it not only positioned me to be of help, but it also helped me financially.
And I think this is wonderful. I'd love to unpack this. And it's great when you hear stories like this. And clearly you're trying to help other people learn those same skill sets and the opportunities. I believe part of it was also much like we talk about for a brand, for someone to get on a board, you had unique access and awareness of the community. I know multicultural marketing, for example, is one of the pillars of your profile now, but it almost happened to you by accident, right? How did you go from that first board where it was almost by accident to building the brand and a reputation to get onto the next board role?
Well, what's interesting is that what looked like an accident from my perspective was really a strategy from the bank's perspective. To your point, I was familiar with the neighborhood, whereas none of the other directors either worked in or lived in this neighborhood. The bank had challenges with compliance for the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which requires that, among other things, that banks grant access to credit to people in low-income neighborhoods. The bank was having difficulty doing that. The bank had reputational challenges that having a person like myself on the board would address.
Right.
And so what I saw, based on my own history and my perspective, what I saw as a kind of social outreach by the bank, I quickly learned was a business strategy of the bank, because my being on the board gave the bank more visibility among my church members. My being on the board gave the bank access to information about the neighborhood. For instance, I was on the loan committee, and there was a fella who actually was a member of my church that applied for a loan to put a business in the neighborhood that the neighborhood didn't want. And although he was a church member, I was able to convince the board not to grant the loan because I was in touch with the pulse of the neighborhood. They were shocked that I would oppose one of my own church members, but the fact of the matter is that was a good business decision for the bank. And
it's also a good example of what a director has to do and balance multiple stakeholder groups.
Well, exactly right. So it was a good business decision, and it was at that point that I discovered that deeper than race, more important than racial diversity, is the need for the private sector to make good business decisions. And I was really growing into this awareness. I'd never really been on the private sector side. And as a result of that experience, I began looking into this whole issue of corporate directorships. I began reading magazines. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I became with people that I knew very well. There were significant African-American religious and political leaders who had ended up on the boards of many corporations. I saw the kind of fees they earned much greater and more significant than the little fees I made at this bank. And I decided then, that was almost 30 years ago, I decided that this was something I would include in my own career path, that it was literally an extension of my ministry. And while some guys like me choose activism, some guys choose politics, I decided that the extension of my ministry and service to people would be in the corporate sector. And so corporate directorships became my goal.
So I love this. So you were intentionally building your brand and probably started networking your reputation. And given your story, I'm guessing it was still probably a good bit of time before you became a director on the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. So I'd love to hear about some of that period and how you, I'm going to call it, professionalized yourself into a directorship.
Very, very interesting story. In my 9th year as pastor of First Baptist in Somerset, the governor of New Jersey asked me to complete the unexpired term of the state's Secretary of State. And I was in the middle of a building project and couldn't do it right away. She held the position open. In New Jersey, the Secretary of State is appointed by the governor, serves as a constitutional officer of the state, and can only be removed by impeachment of the Senate. So it's a very prestigious constitutional position. And I didn't want to do it at first, but actually the governor, our first and only female governor, Christy Whitman.
I grew up in New Jersey. I remember it well. She used to love driving the snow plows. I remember that.
Yes, sir. She called my wife and convinced my wife that I should do the job. I came home from church one day and she said, "You got to do this." So when the governor and your wife team up on you, there's very little choice. So I served as Secretary of State. And in that capacity, I came to know a lot of the leading political and business leaders of the state, far beyond anything I had ever experienced. One of them was a very close ally of the governor. He had raised money for her campaign. He was a big-time Wall Street banker. And after I served as Secretary of State, because of the interaction he and I had, he recommended me to the White House because during those days, the public directors for the Federal Home Loan Bank system were appointed by the president. And so Mr. Lou Eisenberg, who today is the American ambassador to Italy, he recommended me to the White House. The White House accepted the recommendation and appointed me to the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York. And so I started on the board of a small one-branch bank, and my next bank was the bank that lends money to local banks.
So you're still within the banking sector, but a giant leap forward.
Huge leap forward from $100 million in assets to $100 billion in assets.
That's right. And now I think there's also an interesting transition here because most board roles are not publicly posted, but the Federal Home Loan Bank is different because it's sort of a government entity, and it might have been different from your presidential appointment. But if I remember correctly now, that organization, when they have an open board position, they actually post it now. Is that right?
Yeah, not only do they post it, but you can go online and apply for it. The independent directors have an opportunity to apply through the website and to be selected by the board. Now, the Federal Home Loan Bank system is a kind of cooperative, and banks belong to the Federal Home Loan Bank. So the majority of the directors at each Federal Home Loan Bank, there are 11 of us, are the representatives of the banking industry. So, for instance, on our board, there are 19 directors, 12 are industry directors, and 7 of us are public or independent directors. And I'm an independent director who actually has been designated as a public interest director, which means that it's my job to represent the interests of the public in the system that is ultimately supported by taxpayer money should the system go down. So there's a government guarantee, and that's what makes the public interest role so significant.
And I think this is wonderful knowledge for our listeners because this is not a typical situation, but it's a great situation. It's really interesting. And to the best of your knowledge, is this a specific thing for the federal home loan banks, or is this a lot of the government entities that are in these sort of quasi positions?
No, the Federal Home Loan Bank system has a unique construct. And Fannie Mae, for instance, Ginnie Mae and others have different points of access and different processes to become a part of their governing body. But the Federal Home Loan Bank system is consistent throughout the country in how you become a director. And I'm on a committee of all of the banks because the banks have been concerned about expanding in diversity, and so it's a system-wide diversity committee, and I sit on that committee. We meet 4 times a year to recommend to local banks how to diversify, and a part of this passion. I mean, you were kind in describing me as wanting to pay it forward, but in addition to paying it forward, what I've learned in my corporate directorships, I've been on 6 paid corporate boards over the last 25 years, is that boards are looking for people that can round out their experience.
Mm-hmm.
But often, like myself, uh, people don't see themselves as being potential corporate directors.
Right.
And I would say today that there are more companies looking for non-traditional directors than there are people who aren't traditional directors who believe they could become directors. And so I'm hoping through my webinar and my courses and my speeches and through this podcast to convince someone that you too can be a corporate director. And not only is it a blessing to you, but you can bring to a corporate environment gifts, perspectives, and contributions that you probably don't realize you can bring.
I think that was beautifully said, because diversity is the term that everybody throws around. And often people are talking about it in terms of gender. It might be socioeconomic background and perspective. Certainly we hear it in terms of skill set on the board. So, and this is where it tends to skew younger, might be a social media expert or a cyber expert, which is different than perhaps some of the skill set are existing. But I imagine you're opening it up into wider avenues as well. Can you help our audience paint more of the full picture?
Well, one of my real passions is to include in the whole conversation around diversity young people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm on one board that is having to be very, very aggressive in expanding our technology. We're going from a server-based operation to a cloud-based operation.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of our directors, when we began talking about the cloud, they thought we were talking about the weather.
Right.
And it took months before we could bring certain directors up to date. Well, there are young people who have been living with keyboards all of their lives. And to the extent that technology-driven companies are disrupting so many industries, the more companies have young people at the leadership level, the less likely it is that they'll be caught off guard by these tech companies that understand things that young people take for granted and older people take more time to realize. So when you look at all of the disruption that's happening, you and I are on a podcast, and in many instances, podcasts are more popular than broadcasts on radio. I know I have more listeners to my podcast from the church than I had on my radio broadcast 20 years ago. And so I think to the extent that diversity has to include younger people, again, it's not tokenism. It's just an important business strategy to have younger people that are creating companies to disrupt some of the traditional powerhouses, sit on the boards of these traditional companies and spare them the pain of going out of business because the future caught them by surprise.
I like some of what you've said there, and I absolutely agree. So we always want to give nuggets here to help the boards also improve. So for some people, they might be in a position like yourself, they're just on their first board. They're thinking about how to professionalize themselves, how to round out their skill set, their branding, and their marketing. And in some ways, I'd love to continue this story. This is fascinating. So you have now gone from a small bank, a little opportunity where you've dipped your toe in it. Now you're on a massive scale. You got a huge platform, and you went there, and I guess Independence Realty Trust was probably your next opportunity, probably about 2 years after that. Could you talk about how that came about? Was it through networking and branding? How did that get realized?
Again, very, very, very interesting. And I'll just spare me just 30 seconds to also include that between the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York and Independence Realty Trust, I approached a couple of people that I've known for a long time who served as corporate directors to ask them for mentorship and guidance, and they would not help me. One guy would not return my phone call. Another guy looked at me and said, "I think you're doing fine," and walked away. So, part of my passion, again, is to be there for people in ways that some significant people were not there for me. However, I believe that every relationship is important. I've never done a business deal. I've only done business relationships. And I try to treat people with respect. and I try to perform in whatever capacity in a way that represents excellence. So one of the attorneys that I met when I was Secretary of State again uh, represented a company that had excess assets because of the financial crisis, and those assets were in the form of multifamily housing. And this fellow was general counsel to that company. That company decided to spin off a real estate investment trust and transfer the assets that they owned into the real estate investment trust. Then, and they needed 5 persons to be directors. And the attorney, who was familiar with my work, not only in government, but familiar with my work in affordable multifamily housing, recommended me, and I became one of the founding directors of this real estate investment trust called Independence Realty Trust. And we took the company public, and now we own about 16,000 units of housing around the country.
And now you've checked that box of being a director in a public company, which is one of the other
Right.
big steps as well, which I'm sure has just opened up tremendous doors for you. And it's that old adage of how to get a job, that experience, how to experience without a job. So people have talked about going into private equity as a good example. Maybe the company goes public. You had that sort of type of situation. So now your brand has grown and developed in enormous ways, I'm sure.
Correct. The experience is invaluable, and I even am called upon to speak at conferences. I spoke at the National Association for Corporate Directors because, in addition to the corporate directorship, what I learned early is that it's important to zoom in on some area of expertise within the world of governance.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 3 critical areas in corporate governance. One is auditing. And auditing requires a strong financial background, which I don't have. I've never taken a course in anything financial.
It's okay. You're not missing much. It's audit.
Right. Auditing was not going to be my area of expertise. Increasingly, since the financial crisis, risk has become a very hot button issue and area in corporate governance. And again, risk is a highly specialized area, and I have no background that would suggest any expertise in area of risk. But the third area is executive compensation. And this whole idea of rewarding executives when companies are failing and giving a disproportionately high amount of compensation to executives while the regular people are underpaid. And so I decided to zoom in.
And that's a huge hot button topic these days.
Hot button topic. So I decided to zoom in on executive compensation. And so now on all 3 of my boards, 2 public, 1 a government-sponsored entity, GSE, but reports to the SEC, I am now chairman of the compensation committee for all 3 companies. So I've zoomed in on executive compensation as my area of corporate governance expertise. And now as I begin looking at my next board opportunity, I'll be able to not only tout experience as a director, but I'll be able to talk very specifically about my philosophy and my experience in executive compensation.
And I think what we're hearing through this is just a logical progression. Now, some people would say it's amazing how it worked out, but part of that was just networking, doing a good job, reputation precedes you, but you've been intentional about that and grown and developed it, and now you have that brand, and that's exactly what's going to continue to sell you as you move forward. So that makes great sense. And this is probably a wonderful time to transition to hear more about your course, because I'm sure some people are saying, well, that worked for you, but how do I grow and become, you talked about you were sort of like single A baseball with that one branch bank, and now you're playing for the Yankees in center field with a public company, right? Chairing one of the boards.
Right.
So I would love to hear more about the course that you're sharing with people and helping them grow and develop.
Well, what happened was I got so many questions, again, from people that I knew and others. And I'm really busy focusing on my church ministry, and I have a whole financial literacy program that I lead, and we train churches in using our curriculum. I really didn't want to break from that and spend much time on it, but I did feel accountable to share what I knew. So I did this 1-hour webinar where I just walked through the process. I told my story. I put it on YouTube, and the response was overwhelming. I mean, thousands of people, literally almost 20,000 people, if not more, saw this webinar and commented on wanting more information, and they wanted me to call them at their office. And I was a bit overwhelmed by the response to this 1-hour webinar.
So these are now the people
so,
coming to you for the mentoring help, right?
Right. So now I feel really badly, because I don't want them to say, now I went to this guy and he didn't have time for me, or he wasn't trying to help me. I felt a little guilty. So what I did was I sat down and I did an outline of everything I know, not only about becoming a corporate director, but the considerations one needs to make if one is serious about being a corporate director. I mean, for instance, when you read in a magazine that a corporate director like myself may make $100,000 for going to 4 meetings. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity.
It does, but it's not reality.
It's not reality. Number one, it's more than 4 meetings. Number two, half of that $100,000 is probably given to you in stock, which means that the cash portion really has to go to pay the taxes.
Right.
That you have to pay on $100,000, which means that you can't sell the stock because you're a director of the company, and you can't sell stock while you're serving until years later. So what I do is flesh out all of those kinds of issues that no one talks about, people don't teach you, so that not only do you know how to identify your gifts and skills, how to speak to people that are already directors in a way that will get them to help you, how to identify corporations where there's probably an opportunity. I also talk about some of the things to consider before even trying to become a corporate director, so that when you become a director, you're not shocked or you disqualify yourself from being able to serve. So that's what the course is about. It ended up being, I think, about 2.5 to 3 hours. It's broken into 15 modules, and so each module is about 8 to 10 minutes, and it's filmed in the boardroom of one of my companies. So it looks like a board.
That's great.
It feels like a board, and I just share everything I know, everything I wish someone had told me, everything I've learned over 25 years, and most importantly, everything that's critical for you to consider to not only motivate you to become a corporate director, but also prepare you for service as a corporate director.
Which is wonderful. So you've encapsulated all of those nuggets that would give someone a running start.
Correct. I tried to.
And I love the subtitle, The Secrets from Inside the Boardroom.
Yeah, it's unfortunately but true. It's an inside game. There are a number of search firms, for instance, that companies hire to source people that can become directors. But all of the data show that 80 to 90% of new directorships come as a result of relationships between the new directors and the older directors.
Which makes sense. We want people that we trust and we can vouch for, and we heard it in your story today.
Who wants to invite a stranger, to work with them as a fiduciary, someone who is financially accountable for the goings on in a company, and they don't know who they are and have no experience with them.
Well,
so
especially
this is really
because
an inside game.
I think most people don't realize how important culture is for a board to be effective. And especially if you're only meeting a small number of times a year, to really be efficient when you're there, having a known entity makes a big difference in that regard.
Culture is critical, and it's not racial, and it's not gender. It has to do with values. It has to do with camaraderie. It has to do with trust and confidentiality. It has to do with integrity and ethics, and that's what constitutes culture. You can have a board of one gender, but multiple cultures. You can have a board of directors or a group of one ethnic background, but still not have one culture. And so that issue of culture and congeniality, these issues are critical, and I stress that in my course. You could be an expert at the subject, but be an idiot from a personality standpoint. You got to be able to work with people. You have to be able to compromise.
Sure. I mean, street smarts versus book smarts, things like that. Right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe we could just give a little bit of a teaser for a second. I would love to hear your recommendation for someone who wants to pivot their career in order to primarily think about eventually having a portfolio of board roles. What would you suggest?
Right. Well, what I do talk about in the course is you take a piece of paper and write down 50 things about yourself that are just great. 50 things, 50 attributes, 50 positive characteristics. What would someone else say about you if they were describing you to their friends? And that collection of assets includes 2 or 3 things that make you highly marketable as a potential director. That if you're not in touch with your strengths, if you are overly humble, if you've not assessed what you really bring as a value proposition to a group of business leaders, then you'll never become a director. And I offer not only the course, but for a limited number of people, I offer coaching. You'd be shocked to know how many people can't get past like 8 or 12 because there are things about ourselves that we just take for granted that are real strengths. Punctuality is a strength. Every board I'm on starts our meetings before the meeting time because every director of every board I'm on shows up either live or on the phone at least 10 minutes before the meeting starts.
My personal philosophy has always been, what is it? Early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable.
Exactly. So if your personality is such that you are like you, that early is on time and on time is late, that's a strength that makes you perfectly qualified to consider being on a board, because that's the culture. I'm on 3 different boards where no one on either board knows each other, but that's the culture. If we have a conference call, no later than 5 minutes prior to the call, everybody's on. Live meeting, 15 minutes, everybody's in the room.
Well, that's very important for whoever's managing your calendar to know to make sure they're doing that for you, right?
Exactly.
Well, I think this has been a tremendous story, hearing from people how it is possible to go from, let's just say, a non-traditional background in many ways, but where your quantified expertise and skill set was able to be honed and developed and through relationships and made it up to what I'm going to call again the major leagues. And it's just fantastic. But also I love how you're paying that back. You're sharing that knowledge. You're unlocking the keys to the kingdom to others. So DeForest Soaries, I am so thrilled that you were on the Boardroom Bound podcast today and you're able to share this information with our listeners.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be on your podcast. I'm honored to be in the positions I'm in, and I'm honored to have an opportunity to share with others some of what I've learned that can hopefully help them even exceed my accomplishments. So thank you.
Well, thank you. So we will definitely be putting links in the show notes to your course so people have access to that. And if people wanted to follow up with you directly, I know you talked about maybe a coaching role, what would be the best way they should reach out?
Well, dbsoaries.com is my website. And if your listeners would simply use the code word podcast, we'll make sure we give them a 20% discount on the course. I don't do the course to make money, but it did cost me money to produce the course, and we're trying to recoup expenses. And so just the word podcast will let me know that you signed up for the course as a result of listening to this podcast. I'll make sure my team puts in the code and you'll get a 20% discount automatically.
Well, that's great. We always appreciate special bonus opportunities for our audience. So, DeForest, we are delighted to have had you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us be boardroom bound.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with DeForest Soaries. I love his approach of someone who's been successful in an amazing career journey from one little bank branch as a paid director, surprised that he was being paid for it, to becoming a director at the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, then to a public company board, and how it's continued to snowball after that. And while he's grown and developed, he remembered when he wasn't getting the help he needed with the mentoring and coaching early on. So he's trying to help other people, and he specifically developed a course just about this, all of the tips and the secrets from inside the boardroom as he describes it. The course is called How to Become a Paid Corporate Director, and we've got a special promotion for everybody, a 20% off code to take that just for listeners of our podcast by entering the code PODCAST. Shocking. You won't forget that one. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to all of the resources, including this course. Now, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please take 30 seconds to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews on iTunes are one of the best ways to get out word about this podcast. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.